The jungle remembers. Before the gunfire, before flares lit the sky and turned night into something harsh and unnatural, there was only the steady rhythm of the land. Leaves moved in the heat, insects filled the air with sound, and a river cut quietly through the landscape, unnoticed. Then on a morning in March 1967, that stillness was broken in a way that could not be undone. What remains after a battle fades? And what does war reveal about those who pass through it? This is the story of Fire Support Base Gold, of a single clash where planning, uncertainty, and human endurance came together in the middle of the Vietnam War. Long before the first shots were fired, the area around Suoi Tre followed a rhythm, shaped by nature rather than conflict. The soil was heavy and red, the jungle thick and close. Farmers worked narrow clearings, moving carefully through an environment that demanded attention. The air was dense with humidity slowing every movement. Life here required effort, but it was understood. Villagers woke early. Cooking fires sent thin lines of smoke into the morning air. Children moved along worn paths, their routines shaped by family and land. But the distant sound of helicopters had begun to interrupt that rhythm. War was no longer distant, it was approaching. For American forces, Vietnam presented a different kind of challenge. There were no fixed front lines, no clearly defined battlefield. The environment itself blurred the boundaries. The jungle concealed movement, disrupted visibility, and made it difficult to predict where the next engagement might come from. By early 1967, the United States had committed significant resources to addressing that uncertainty. Large-scale operations aimed to locate and disrupt Viet Cong forces, to limit their mobility and to bring a degree of control to an unpredictable conflict. Operation Junction City was one of the largest efforts of its kind. It reflected both confidence and urgency. Within that operation, Fire Support Base Gold was established, a temporary position designed to project artillery power into surrounding areas and support ongoing operations. At first glance, it was a simple outpost, a cleared space in the jungle. Defensive lines built quickly, artillery positioned with care, sandbags stacked, trenches cut into the ground. But for the soldiers stationed there, it carried far greater weight. It represented security but also exposure. It was a place built to hold ground, but one that could be tested at any moment. Most of the men there were young. Many were experiencing combat for the first time. Along with their training and equipment, they carried certain expectations that their firepower would provide an advantage, that clear engagement would favor their position. At night they listened. The jungle had its own language, subtle, constant, and not always easy to read. A shifting branch, a distant movement, a sudden quiet. Over time they learned to interpret these sounds, or at least to believe they could. Some wrote letters home, choosing words carefully. Others kept their thoughts to themselves. Humor, when it appeared, was often brief and sharp. Tension rarely showed itself directly, but it was always present. Then came the morning of March 21st. The attack did not begin suddenly. It was deliberate. Viet Cong forces had observed the base. They understood its layout and its reliance on visibility and response time. Rather than confront those strengths directly, they chose to disrupt them. As dawn approached, movement in the jungle was no longer random. It was organized, controlled. The first indication came with incoming mortar fire. Rounds landed across the base with little warning, breaking the early morning calm. The impact was immediate. Defensive positions were shaken, and the sense of control that had defined the base quickly began to shift. Soldiers moved from rest to action within seconds. Communication lines came alive. Orders were issued and adjusted as the situation changed. The perimeter, carefully prepared, was now under pressure. Then the ground assault followed. Viet Cong fighters moved out of the tree line, closing distance quickly. They used the terrain to their advantage, advancing through confusion created by the initial barrage. Inside Fire Support Base Gold, time seemed to compress. Moments stretched. Decisions carried immediate consequences. Every movement required focus. Artillery crews worked under pressure, adjusting fire and maintaining support even as the distance between friendly and enemy positions narrowed. Infantry units moved to reinforce vulnerable points, navigating noise, smoke, and limited visibility. The distinction between attack and defense blurred. The priority became holding the position. In close combat, the larger context of war fades. There is little room for strategy in the moment when someone reacts to immediate danger. Training takes over, shaping decisions that must be made quickly and without hesitation. An artilleryman continues his work despite the strain, focusing on the task in front of him. A radio operator maintains communication, his voice steady even as conditions around him shift rapidly. Across the same battlefield, Viet Cong fighters advanced with determination. For them, the terrain was familiar. Their objective was clear even as the risks increased with each step. Different sides, different perspectives, but both operating within the same narrow margin between survival and loss. As the engagement continued, it became a test of endurance. What began as a coordinated strike developed into a prolonged exchange. American artillery and air support increased in intensity, reinforcing the base's defensive capability. Viet Cong forces continued their advance despite growing pressure. The attack reflected planning and commitment. It was intended not only to challenge the base, but to demonstrate that even fortified positions could be reached and contested. Fire support base gold became more than a location. It became a measure of how each side would respond under pressure. Over time, the impact of the fighting became more visible. The ground showed signs of sustained engagement. Equipment was damaged. Defensive positions were altered by repeated impacts. Medical teams moved through the base focusing on immediate care. Their work required speed, precision, and calm under pressure. Amid the noise of the battle, there were quieter moments, calls for assistance, attempts to locate missing team members, brief exchanges that carried weight far beyond their words. By the time the fighting subsided, the base remained in American control. From a tactical standpoint, it had held against the attack. The immediate objective had been achieved, but the experience left a lasting impression. The engagement demonstrated that even well-supported positions could be challenged under the right conditions. It highlighted the adaptability and determination of opposing forces. It also reinforced a broader understanding that the conflict in Vietnam would not follow a simple or predictable path. Beyond the battlefield, the effects extended outward. Reports of engagements like this reached audiences far from Vietnam, often summarized in brief accounts. Still, each report contributed to a growing awareness that the war was more complex than initially understood. Within the larger context of the Cold War, individual battles carried broader significance. They influenced perception, policy, and public discussion. For civilians in Vietnam, the impact was immediate and ongoing. Communities found themselves navigating uncertainty, adjusting to conditions where stability was difficult to maintain. The conflict shaped daily life in ways that extended far beyond military operations. As the war continued, so did the questions surrounding it. Different perspectives emerged both within the United States and internationally. Public discussion grew more active, reflecting a range of views about the purpose and direction of the conflict. Accounts from those who served added depth to the conversation. Reporting evolved as journalists sought to present a more complete picture of events on the ground. Over time, the way the war was understood began to shift. Fire support base gold became one of many engagements that defined that period. Its significance lies not only in the outcome but in what it revealed. It contributed to evolving military thinking, particularly in understanding the challenges of fighting in unfamiliar terrain against a flexible and determined opponent. It also became part of personal and collective memory. For those who were there, it remained a reference point, an experience that shaped how they understood the conflict and their place within it. Today, the area around Suoi Tre has changed. The landscape continues to grow and recover. At a glance, it may appear untouched, but history remains part of the ground itself. What happened there is not always visible, but it has not disappeared. War does not end entirely when the fighting stops. Its effects continue, carried in memory, in reflection, and in the questions that follow. What was achieved? What was lost? What can be understood from it now? Fire support base gold was one moment in a larger conflict. But like many moments in history, it offers a way to examine something broader: the decisions, assumptions, and realities that define war. The jungle remains quiet again in its own way, but the events of that day are still part of its story. Not spoken, not visible in detail, but present, and still open to reflection.